And Hammer here again this week to talk to you about what's going on. Did you notice how I just completely jumped over your last name so I didn't create that faux pas again this week?
There you go. I'm the one that insists on using an
Helmer.
odd name.
Hammer Helmer. Anyways, to give you your update on what's going on with interest rates. So there's been a lot of and interest rates, the bond market, just kind of a general discussion on it. So you know what to kind of look out for, what to watch for that'll indicate change. And then you have a baseline of understanding of where the market's at right now. A lot going on. I think many of you in this community specifically impacted differently, whether you're a veteran and you're kind of looking at things and considering things, and that's calling up old things, and you're sitting on the sidelines, whatever it is, whether you're active duty, preparing, and actually going through different processes right now of readiness and preparedness, or whether you're reservist and you've been mobilized to a degree, at least to get everything ready in case some reactions have to be had. So you all in your life right now have a ton of different things going on that are considerations, but specifically those of you curious about what's going to happen and what's going on with the bond market because of these other factors, we wanted to hop on today and chat a little bit about that. So Hammer could kind of give you some information to let you know where we're at and where things could be going and what to watch out for that would indicate a directional change. So Hammer, pretty crazy couple weeks, yeah?
Absolutely.
I mean, just all over the place, like manic even as far as what bond yields have been doing. I think there's a lot of talk about a billion different things that we could start with or go over, but why don't you walk us through the most logical progression of understanding as far as the last couple of weeks and then where we're at right now?
All right. So first thing, I think it's important for everybody to recognize that headlines are there to get more clicks and to make people read newspapers and that kind of a thing. So you're going to see a lot of movement in headlines. Sometimes they're more current than other words. In other words, what I mean by that is sometimes rates have already moved positive and they're claiming they're negative, and they're moved negative and they're claiming they're positive. So that creates a lot of uncertainty and maybe a little bit of fear. Maybe you guys aren't quite sure what's going on with rates. So if you're looking at the news sources, just recognize that that's a sign of volatility. The volatility right now caused by a couple of different factors. The first one, probably the biggest one, of course, being the Russian-Ukraine war. Now, Christopher, it is a war, right? They declared war.
Yeah, I think for lack of a better word, and regardless of what other nations are saying, I think anytime that you're bombing places, killing civilians, killing military, like
I call that a war.
I think we can comfortably say that it's a war for sure.
All right, so we got that part out of there. So you got this Russian-Ukraine war. Now, normally what happens in a time of war, it creates uncertainty in the global market and economies, and that's generally something that uncertainty is bad for stocks. So you guys may have seen that stocks took a beating and they've had some really bad days, and generally that means that bonds do well. And the reason for that is that when someone has money to invest, let's say I've got my $1 million, I'm a hedge fund, very, very small one, and I've got my $1 million, and I might put it in what's called a risk on performance, which means I want to put it into something that's got more risk to it, but I'm going to get a better return on my investment. I'm going to get a better reward. So I put my money into stocks and I'm trading away. And then what happens is this whole Russian-Ukraine scenario happens and everyone's like, okay, not quite sure how this is going to play out. And I'm going to take my money out of stocks and I want to keep it safe, but I don't want to just keep it in the banks. I don't want to keep it on the sidelines because then I'm just losing money actually because of inflation. So I want to put it in something. I'm going to put it in bonds. Bonds are protected to some extent. In fact, the safest bond is the US Treasury because it's backed by the US government, and the government says we're going to make sure you get paid back. That's the safest one. And it's got a very low rate of return, but it's a very safe place to put my money, and at least I'm getting something back on it. So when you see people pull money out of stocks and put money into bonds in a time of uncertainty, that's what we call a flight to safety. And we did see that a few times. We've seen that when the first news came out that Russia had indeed invaded Ukraine, even though we were all expecting it, it did happen. And that was the first flight to safety. And we saw when bonds improve a little bit, that can help mortgage rates because, as we've talked about in the past, there's actually bonds that are tied to your mortgages, and your mortgages are actually traded on the bond market. So when this flight to safety goes to bonds, mortgage rates can improve a little bit, but just a little bit, not any big moves. We're not going to see, I've heard rumors. People are like, oh, rates are going to drop into the twos. No, they're not. That's not realistic. We're going to see very small improvements. But then what happens is things settle down a little. Now I want to take my money back out and I put it back into stocks for a while. And then mortgage rates creep up a hair. Maybe they go up 1/8 of a point that you see it, or maybe your closing costs change in that scenario. And then last week on Friday, we were improving last week, but we had some concerns on Friday because of jobs data. And jobs data affects our other big factor, and that's the Fed. So right now, the US economy is just running way too hot. We've got inflation as a big problem, and everyone is seeing inflation from your cost of gas, your cost of food, your cost of any of the goods that you're buying. So inflation is a big problem. And the only way that we can curb inflation as a country, as a banking system, is to push down and have less people borrowing. We want money to move slower, basically. And the way that the Fed does that is they manipulate the Fed funds rate, which is the rate that banks lend each other money, and that actually trickles through the whole system and slows everything down. So just a couple weeks ago, we had huge inflation numbers, and everyone was saying, "Wow, the Fed. We know that this Fed is going to have to raise rates, their policy rates, that Fed funds rate, in this March meeting that they're going to have." And that March meeting is March 16th, and in fact, generally, when the Fed makes this move, they raise rates very small increments at 1/4%. They raise their Fed funds rate. And everyone said, you know what, though? They're going to need to go shock and awe, baby. They're going to swing big. They're going for the rafters. They're going to have to do a 1/2 point rate hike this time. And everybody was like, yeah, they're going to have to do a 1/2 point rate hike. And that got a bunch of momentum. And then what that did is that actually pushed mortgage rates to get a little bit worse because of just the way that everything plays together. And then now with this Russia-Ukraine scenario, everybody was like, remember that whole idea, that 1/2 point thing? Yeah, that's not going to happen. And it went from almost a sure thing to a nothing. It's literally not even considered to be on the menu right now. So that's kind of cooled off, and that's another way that the Russia-Ukraine situation has affected what's going on here with our mortgage rates is that Fed's reaction. So with what we're looking at today, a couple of things you got to ask yourself is, number one, are you shopping around when you look to get your mortgage rate? And if you are, it's important that you shop at the same time, at the same day, and that you get those quotes so that you can truly compare apples to apples. Because if you're not doing that, you're not comparing the same thing. Friday's rate quote compared to this morning's rate quote will be different because Friday had different things going on and affected the markets differently, which affected our mortgage rates differently. So I think it's important that everyone recognize that you do want to shop around. Christopher, do you think people should shop around?
I'm glad that you asked that question, Hammer. Absolutely. I think the fastest way for you to save money is by shopping in literally anything, not just this industry, but every industry. And so by shopping, you also begin to understand the different quality that's out there, the different options that are out there. And typically you're going to choose an option that you feel best suits your circumstance. And so that's what we want, is an informed decision. But I want to say, for what it's worth, for the last week and a half, 2 weeks now, Hammer, what have mortgage interest rates done?
They've gone up a little bit, down a little bit, up a little bit, down a little bit. They've generally stayed within that very same tight range.
I would say that's pretty close, but I think we're a little lower than we were a couple weeks ago, especially with considering like what was the big fear 2 weeks ago? Everyone's like, oh my God, interest rates are going through the roof. And we were saying, don't freak out, don't freak out, don't freak out. But everyone's freaking out. And so now
that's true.
A lot of other stuff is going on. And what's happening? Everyone's freaking out. Well, don't freak out. Don't freak out. The point and the common denominator in all of this is don't freak out just because things begin to change. Wait a little bit and understand how they're going to continue to change, because either way, you're still going to want to be par. You're still going to want to find whatever the market is that day, right? And you want to be focused on that, not so much what's happened or what's going to happen. You want to make the best timely choice that you can, but your people are too worried about too many things they can't control and that will change necessarily the thing they were worried about yesterday. And so that yesterday's concern that completely enveloped them is gone to a degree, right? Y'all had last week what we had on, I don't know if did you see the Logan interview that we did in here, Hammer?
I saw parts of it, yeah.
He talked about the 210 potential inversion, which is a flag he's had up for a while. We've visited on this thing about potential recessionary type events and the impact that all of that has to do with bonds. And then the Russian-Ukraine war, right, that's impacting things globally to see what's going on. But there are a lot of occurrences that in my mind, like all of the people that are out there that are either rushing to try to get to a refinance that they think that they're late to, either cash out or earl, or rushing to purchase. Don't rush. I don't think people have a driver that says sprint now, outside of if you've never bought a home and you're renting, buy.
Yeah.
If you're able to, and you can do so responsibly, right? There's some questions that come up in the community about when you're ready versus when you're not. I'll tell you all from my experience, it's not a determination that you or I can make, because I've made choices at periods of times where factually I would not have thought necessarily that was the best circumstance, but it wasn't a difficult thing at all, and it equated to some of the largest growth I've ever had in my life. So the point being, if there's any impetus, it's that if you're ready, willing, and wanting to buy a home, do so. Because the main driver to the issues that you have is, regardless of what interest rates do up or down, you have a declining supply and an increasing demand. And that in and of itself is likely to impact what you can receive in value when you buy a home, regardless of how much the cost of the money that you're borrowing or creating to buy that home is going to have.
Yeah. Along that point, two things. One, I'm counseling my own daughter who's ready to go out house hunting, and they're looking to buy over the next 6 to 8 months, maybe a little bit longer. And, some people say, well, is now a good time to buy a house? And even for my own daughter, I'm like, absolutely. Now is the time to buy a house. You definitely want to be out there. And I was visited by a friend yesterday who's a real estate agent in Florida. And, he looked on his phone, and I kind of gave him that look, because, we're hanging out together. Get off your phone. And he said, oh, I'm sorry. I had this listing. We've had 30 offers for this listing. 30 offers. So even when rates have gone up from their best levels, and they've gone up, pretty significantly in that last 8 months, where they went from the twos into the threes into the fours, and yet it's not slowing down. The housing market's still running at 100 miles an hour. So definitely, you want to get in on it. It's not going anywhere.
Well, so with that said, as far as the mortgage market, what are your thoughts on where it could likely go, given that we're battling some of these challenges from, a Russian-Ukraine war, which hopefully just stays isolated to those two statements, right? But some of the other instability economically around that, the Fed's desire to do the thing that we all thought and was somewhat needed, right? Rates needed to come up to hopefully slow down the rush, right? The demand for properties, because that in and of itself can cause inflationary trends as well.
Right.
But with the 2-year, 10-year getting kind of really close together as it is, some economic concerns, we still have great, strong jobs data, but all of the variables they're not trending. They're volatile. They seem to argue with each other a little bit. So what are your thoughts on, 30 days, 60 days, 120 days out?
Well, that like you said, 120 days out, it's really hard to make those decisions. So sometimes the idea of security with one in the hand versus, two in the bush kind of a thing, where you can lock in what's in now. The main thing I think everyone needs to recognize is that even though we have seen rates improve and they get a little bit worse and then improve again, we're not seeing big movements. We're not seeing anything that should stop you from making any kind of decision. Be careful, like I said, about reading into what's in the headlines. That can drive you crazy. If you try to time the market in the market like this, it's going to drive you nuts. There are little pockets, and if you're working with a lender, they can give you some insight into when's a good time that, now might be a little bit better than yesterday, but today might be a little bit worse than tomorrow, kind of a thing. But overall, don't get too caught up trying to time the market on when to lock in your interest rate. All of these rates still very low, and where they'll be compared to 30 days from now, I think that they'll be very similar 30 days from now. I don't think we're going to see a big move 30 or even 60 days from now. Like I said, some days you'll say, hey, I just bought rocks for some landscaping, right? I bought 3 pallets of rocks, and these things are like $220 a piece. And of course, when I go to pay for them, the woman says, oh, wouldn't you know, we just raised the price last week. And I'm like, don't tell me that. I wasn't here last week. I don't have my DeLorean. I can't go back. So I don't even want to know I said, you know what, that's fine. But I don't want to know what they were, because I have to buy them at what they're at now. And I'm okay with that, because before I heard that statement, I was perfectly happy. I thought to myself, wow, $220 for a pallet of rocks. That's a good deal. And then all of a sudden, my feelings of good deal disappeared as soon as she said, well, the price just went up yesterday, so don't let that happen to you. Once you lock in your interest rate, just be done with it. Don't worry about those headlines driving you crazy. As far as, let's dig deeper into some of the knowledge on it, that being the results, as far as the knowledge piece. So one thing that everybody should know, when the Fed officials come out and make public statements, they tend to move markets, they tend to move rates. And we've had a lot of that happen over the last month with the idea of, will the Fed raise rates by 0.5% or will they raise rates by 0.25% at this first meeting in March? And we've gone into what's called a blackout period. So basically about 10 days before the meeting, at that Saturday before the Saturday before the meeting, the Fed officials all stop their statements. They don't make any policy statements. They don't make anything. They're all go on a blackout. So we're in that blackout period. So we don't have to worry about seeing any big moves from that angle right now. And that's a good thing because they tend to shake things up a little bit. And we're already in a volatile market. The Fed's gonna raise rates in March. Everybody is ready for that. Markets are ready for that. And in fact, Fed Chair Jerome Powell last week in front of Congress, in his testimony that he gives every few months, he came out and he basically said, yes, we're going to raise rates 0.25%. He was almost as clear as that when he was in that meeting. So everybody's prepared for that. But this is going to be one rate increase in a series of increases. And the next Fed meeting is in May, and they're very likely to raise rates 0.25% then. And then in June, they'll do the same thing. And they're probably going to raise rates 6 times in a row, maybe even 8 times in a row. That's generally what they have to do in order to keep tightening the screws to try to bring inflation down, slow the economy down. And they're looking for what they call a soft landing, meaning that they want to try to slow it down, but not create a recession, not create a scenario where they've gone too far and people stop spending. And that's why the sanctions and the embargoes, they're talking now about possibly embargo against the oil coming from Russia, because before we sanctioned Russia, and we're attacking Russia on the economic side to try to get them to pull back from this Ukraine war. And all of the things that we're seeing now, they're driving up inflation, and they're making the Fed concerned because they know that this is even worse for inflation, but yet it could also affect other parts of the economy. So now the Fed's a little more unsure, and that uncertainty, I think, will come into their comments. And I think it'll basically, that's why I think rates are going to basically stay the same for about a month. Again, they'll go up a little, down a little, but we'll be in the high 3s, low 4s, mid 4s, at the most. What do you think?
I can say it. I think, which, guys, if y'all don't know, I'm a nobody from North Texas. Don't have any crystal balls. I'm not an economic rocket surgeon or anything like that. But I think that there has been a trend in mortgage rate, interest rate direction now for 4 decades. I think that the reason the trend exists is likely anything that hasn't been changed or countered. And I think that overall, the expectation for me personally is that I think that they continue to kind of migrate down. Sure, they will migrate up. They'll come back down. I mean, everything's cyclical to a degree, right? But the overall trend, I don't think, is something necessarily that'll get broken. I think that those of you out there that have marginal savings right now on your interest rates for refinances, I don't think that you should get hasty and jump and do different things, especially if you're having to pay points, having to cover costs and extract equity in the process of doing it. I think you're wasting money, just quite frankly. I think if you're buying a house, none of it really matters. The point is you need to buy the house. The cost is somewhat marginal. And I think that it's weird when you can say this, like theoretically and very honestly, do rising gas prices, Hammer, can rising gas prices to the degree that we're seeing impact mortgage interest rates?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, they sure will, because it affects the cost of goods everywhere. Not only what we pay to fill up our own gas tank, but my son does lawn care. And I had a quick text with him this morning that said, hey, you need to talk to you need to consider raising your prices, because for him to run his equipment, it's the cost of gas. For him to drive to the place that he's going to, it's the cost of gas. The reason that my rocks got more expensive wasn't because there were less rocks. We don't have a supply chain issue with rocks. There's still plenty of them in the ground. It was
plenty of rocks.
It's plenty of rocks. It's the cost to get the rocks to my house. Yeah. It's the cost to get them from one place to another, from that place to my house. And that's why the costs have gone up. and you're going to see that. And when that happens, that's going to slow everything down. And that does play into mortgage rates because of, like we were talking about before, all of this, it's all inflationary, and where expenses go, and it slows down the economy because people don't have the money for the fun things. They're not traveling. They're not necessarily spending. Consumer spending is what drives the U.S. economy. It's actually us as consumers. We drive our own economy. And as that spending is going to have to go down, as people spend more money on gas and costs of other goods go up, that slows everything down. When it slows down, hopefully that would actually be good for mortgage rates when the economy slows down a little bit, because again, that's part of the inflationary pressures are bad, and that would start to slow things down, which will bring the inflationary pressures down.
That said, with slowing economic market conditions, how often do mortgage interest rates rise through slowing economic national situations?
You got anything to point to faster than I do on that one? Because I don't know. I'd have to look that up to really get a good vibe on that. Because we haven't seen these kinds of conditions in well over a decade.
You haven't seen, I think inflation right now is the worst it's been, they've said, since the 80s, right? So, I mean, as far as the exact circumstances, you don't. I think it's interesting. I think that there's a lot of things going on. If you remove the inflation from the picture, I don't think that I'm not sure. I'd have to pull some stuff up, but I don't know that interest rates rise through big economic downturns.
Yeah, not generally.
Right. So I think it'll be interesting to see. I think that people should not freak out. I think trend is your friend, to quote Logan, a buddy of mine. I really agree with that statement in a lot of different ways. But I think hypercritical analysis here is really important because you're making time frame choices, in shorter periods of time. So
yeah, and there's definitely times where based on what's going on in the environment, in the economic environment, you say, hey, listen, you really want to hold off from locking in a mortgage right now because things are very, very likely to improve. And then there's times where you say, hey, listen, you want to lock in as soon as you're ready because it's very, very likely that things could get worse. What we're seeing now is that volatility where, based on how everybody reacts to what's going on those external factors, that sometimes we see improvement, sometimes we see it worsening from week to week. But like I said, and you pointed out, I mean, looking back to when we talked a couple of weeks ago, rates were higher. They were, generally around, again, I'm using as a rough number, everybody. This is not what your rate quote would have been, but if we're using a national average maybe of 4.19 and 4.17, and now we're at 3.96. So they have improved a little bit. But the reality is they could very easily go back up to 4.12, 4.15. And the idea being they're still within that realm. And in our world, in the mortgage world, that's a small move. If we're not seeing rates go from 4% to 5%, when you see rates go from 3.75 to 4.25, and there's a half a point interest rate movement in there, that maybe one day you're getting quoted 3.875 and the next day you're getting quoted 3.99. And that's a very small move. And even though it may feel bigger if in your pocketbook, it's really not a big move. It shouldn't affect you buying a home or even refinancing at that kind of price point.
I actually have one thing I want to leave everyone here with. I'm not for sure the best way to do this. Nathan, I am getting ready to forward you a picture, or unless I should just drop it in the chat here. Let me know what works best. But I want to talk about forest through the trees real quick, especially if you're a home buyer and you're thinking about buying. All of these thoughts, and a lot of people I see hyperventilating on what the bond market's doing, what mortgage interest rates are doing, and they're letting that drive their decision, right, on when, or should I hold off, or should I hear the rates are rising, so I better just wait. You're talking about very marginal movements that can certainly impact your ability to qualify. But I want to talk about something else. I wonder if I can just post it as a comment. It's not letting me drag it there.
You want to screen share it? Or if you post the link, I can put it up on my screen and Nathan can show it.
I don't know what I want to do. I'm not very smart with this kind of stuff super fast. Nathan, I'm texting you the picture right now. I don't know the fastest way that you can get it up, but I think that this is a bigger concern. I think this is the forest through the trees, if you will. I think this is the part most people that are considering buying, especially if they've never purchased before, should really pay attention to. February 2022, total active listings Someone's calling me. Total active listings, 376,018. That's 24.5% down from last year. Right? Look at this chart real quick. And sourcesrealtor.com, there's another, several different sources. The St. Louis Fred is another source I think a lot of people can look at. But this will show you, if you look at the top real quick to define the colors, starting up yellow at the bottom, green 2021, light blue 2020. And then you have 2019, 2018, and 2017 there at the top. And you can see total active listings that are currently on market. As you can see right now, it's the lowest it's been and significantly lower. A lack of inventory for all of you out there that are feeling economic pressure and have from the COVID impact to the economy with the supply chains previously, a lack of inventory is going to drive price or much more aggressively than the interest rate discussion will. Even if at certain points in the market, rapidly rising interest rates may deter price increases to some degree through the ability of what people can actually qualify for to close. So you have comparables. But I think this is the part you should concern yourselves with. I think that you should understand that what's causing this to happen isn't changing fast enough for it to make a drastic change. And so I think that if there's an impetus of time that you should be considering, it is this: it's supply and demand. I think you should focus there very simply for home buyers that are out there looking. There's dwindling supply and increasing demand. And that's been true now for a while with the millennial crew that's coming through as far as a generation of demographic buyers coming online as new home starts. So mortgage rates important, certainly need to pay attention to them, but don't get lost in the bigger issue or the bigger things that are driving what's going to be your likely outcome. The point is, regardless of whether it's a financial benefit or wealth building tool, like even if you don't want to say real estate can make you wealthy, people have to pay for shelter. Shelter is a necessity. And what you need to understand is with the price driving that's going on due to demand, regardless of what happens in your circumstance, whether you buy or not, one of the things that's going to become very real and apparent this year too are rent increases. Buying a house helps you to fix your cost of shelter while also gaining long-term and short-term values. When you rent, you don't have the ability to fix that. So more importantly, I think it's okay to say if you're renting over the next 12 months, expect your rent to go up. It's going to, because the reason why is people coming to market to buy a new house to bring to online so it can be rented are having to pay an elevated cost to do so. And when they pay an elevated cost, investors don't bring a thing to market to lose money. So if you're renting right now, consider buying if you're able. And if you're not able right now, consider what you might need to do to prepare yourself to safely and securely buy a home and fix the cost of your shelter so that you can benefit in many of the other ways I think that home ownership achieves for those that achieve it.
Very good. Very well put.
Would you say inventory will increase dramatically once the rules and regulations make 3D home printing easier to be approved? I think that we've addressed this for a little bit. I would say that increasing the amount of supply to market can absolutely impact price, right? Because it removes some of that all-time low inventory driver, which is causing people to pay astronomically more than what the list cost is so that they can be more competitive and have a higher degree of success. People are doing what they're able to do to achieve the thing they want to do, right? So I think as far as 3D home printing, I'm not for sure if we're at a place right now where 3D home printing on scale is to the point to where over the next 2 or 3 years, 3D home printing is going to be circled as one of the drivers that allowed affordable homes to come online. I don't necessarily think it is, because I think that you already have things like manufactured modular homes that can be slab set, put on pier and beam, made to look honestly not so different than a stick figure property and affixed permanently in a way that valuation is not so dissimilar either, right? So just to say, I think that there's some models for efficiency type housing through manufacturing, whether it's 3D printing or some of the others. And I'm not certain that enough of that is coming online to make a big difference over the next foreseeable future. Your thoughts, Hammer?
Yeah, there's millions of homes built. So yeah, I don't think, unfortunately, that there's enough that can be done. It's kind of like saying, will electric cars make a difference in the price of gas? And there's, a lot more electric cars out there, but there's still a tiny fraction of the fleet of cars that are available. And we'll run into different issues as, 3D home printing grows. You'll have different constraints as far as materials and labor and who's capable of doing them and where have they been adopted. So unfortunately, I don't think that will add enough inventory to not when you look at the population increase. And like you mentioned before, the millennial demographic that's come in, which is a very large home buying demographic. And they've been, these kids are, my daughter actually runs into Gen Z. She's young, but she's a little bit older than her time. So my point is that she's looking for a 4-bedroom house, and their idea of a starter home is a $400,000 house, like in an average area, if you will. So it's a very different demographic and very different setup, and you're just not going to meet it with those things at all.
I love the question, though. For whoever asked, it doesn't show. It just says Facebook user on this one. But I absolutely love the question. Those types of out-of-the-box questions are stuff that we want to handle from y'all as often as we're able. One of our members here says it's an interesting and potentially partial solution to the issue, but I think one of the primary problems is land availability and permitting/regulation to build homes in a timely manner. Of course, labor materials is another issue. So on that, markets to a degree are all geographically limited in that there's a desire to be in a certain focal point for the markets that are, and there's other markets where the desire is to be away from focal points, right? And so I think land availability in some markets impacts it much more than others. But the one place that this comment hits on that's 100% correct, even in a small market that I'm in, some of our biggest issues, and I know this because my dad's a home builder, he's a framer, has been for 30-something years. I know most of the contractors kind of in the area. One of the issues that many of the builders have isn't necessarily just the problems with supply and rising costs and all of these things. It is the regulation difficulties with the cities. A lot of the cities that are growing now, a lot of the areas that are growing aren't set up necessarily with a growth mindset. They haven't looked at their process of approval from an efficiency sake like businesses do, right? And so that, understand, when you add time to the construction process, there's an old cliche, time is money. Well, in building, it absolutely is. And if things take a long time to get approved, you have a degree of less builders that'll even come into that. So I think that one of the fastest things that we can do is, if you happen to watch this and you're a city planner or on a council or this, that, and the other, you might consider how to better make your process efficient for those people trying to bring the properties to market that your city's needs. Whether it's code, looking at the code specifications and making sure that they're not too restrictive and a bit silly and outdated locally here, whatever. But those types of issues absolutely can impact it, I think, as much as anything else. Labor, material, I've even seen some stuff suggesting that people are coming into the labor market and into the trade market now in an increasing kind of a way, but material costs are high. There is demand on those material costs as well, and not just from the people building right now. Ladies and gentlemen, there are people renovating existing product houses that you wouldn't want to move to because they look like they need too much work. There are people moving in and doing that work, and that has the same demand on many of those same products. So I think prices keep going their one way there. Because
all good stuff. But well, that's our half hour, unless you want to keep going.
No, we're solid there. We don't see a whole lot of other questions coming in. Regulations need to catch up to 3D printing as well, was one of the other comments. Sure, regulations need to catch up to reality most of the time. I would agree. But hopefully this message was informative for y'all today. Hopefully you have a better idea of where we sit right now in the mortgage interest rate market and the bond market and where things may go. As far as what can change, literally everything. Follow along every week here, and we'll tell you what's going on. If you have a question that pops up on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, whatever, just post it and we can jump in and answer it for you on the cusp like we do everything else. So thanks for showing up. Thanks for being here. Thanks for asking your questions and learning. Blessings, y'all.
Thanks. Take care.